the human brain can take over in a matter of hours, and while not shut that down completely, significantly mitigate it, or I would say diminish its optimal performance, if that makes sense, right? Just not being there mentally can take weeks and weeks of training. And if it takes a 15 to 20% edge off your performance, that's a win or a loss.
Welcome back to another edition of the Heart to Heart podcast. My guest today is Tony Ricci. He's an athletic performance and mental health coach for athletes. So, Tony, welcome back to the show.
Dr. Hart, great to be here. I consider it a pleasure and an honor, so I'm excited.
Awesome. Yeah. So, there's a bunch of different reasons why I wanted to chat with you today, but like we were just chatting before the show, you have this kind of very interesting background because you do mental performance for a lot of athletes, and then you also do the physical side, the athletic side. And so, just before we kind of get into that though, just give people a little bit of a brief background about yourself.
Yeah, so I had the fortune of being very interested in human performance at a young age, 18 to 19 years old. And being 60 now, I decided at that time to major in something called exercise physiology, which everybody thought was quite strange when I went to college, because there was really only physical education at the time, and only a handful of schools had ex-phys. But my entire life, I was very interested. I loved boxing. My dad was a big boxing fan, and I liked MMA, not MMA at the time, but karate, and I did a lot of judo and jujitsu and stuff. So I always had a strong love for both athletic performance and on the academic side and the actual application. As time went on, I was an exercise physiology major, and I went to later on a sports science master's to further my knowledge. And then after about 5 years of sports science, I kind of said to myself, well, a lot of this doesn't matter if we don't know how to eat. So I went and got a nutrition degree. And then after, what really happened, Dr. Hart, is after many years of doing athletic performance, nutrition, weight cutting, teaching my students about all this as a university professor, I got very interested in the sport neuroscience and sport psychology side. And what happened was, this was about a decade ago, I was working with a guy who was currently already an MMA world champion, and a very popular one. And we had a wonderful camp.
Are you allowed to say who?
Yeah, at that time, it was Chris Weidman. Yes. Okay. And awesome. We had a great camp, but really super camp, and great skill acquisition, physical conditioning. Everything went really great. But the last 2 weeks, there was a lot of stress on his plate, external factors. And it was legitimate. It wasn't somebody just worrying about things. And what I had noticed is we had about 10 weeks of outstanding conditioning, nutrition. Coach Ray Longo, who's an incredible coach, had him in really good condition. But the last 2 weeks, Dr. Hart, were really tough on him mentally. And again, most of it had little to do with the fight, but nevertheless, it was a heavy load. And this impacted his performance significantly because he wound up losing that fight that night and the title. And what I said to myself at that given point was, wow, you can do all this work so well, and everything could be in place. I mean, meticulously. And then the human brain can take over in a matter of hours. And while not shut that down completely, significantly mitigate it, or I would say diminish its optimal performance, if that makes sense, right? Just not being there mentally can take weeks and weeks of training. And if it takes a 15 to 20% edge off your performance, that's a win or a loss, right? We're not saying, hey, you have a great fighter or a great athlete and they completely forget how to play the game. No. But when you're making decisions within milliseconds, when you have to be confident, when you have to take a shot and shake it off, the mental side is vital, and it controls the physical almost completely. So that is when I said to myself, wow, I better really learn about this brain stuff, because if we can shut down performance in a matter of hours, what good is my food? What good is my conditioning? What good is my peripheral knowledge, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. And so, I assume, Tony, you've kind of been in that position again where someone's been, training really, really well. They seem like they're at peak performance, and then maybe something happens to them, before the fight, a couple weeks before, like happened to Chris. And so what do you do differently now than what you did for Chris?
Well, it's great. I didn't know much at that time about it. And by the way, he still took that fight to the fourth round. It wasn't really bad. It just, what he excelled at, he wasn't excelling at. So we know there was a little loss there. But what I do now, if I'm to work with a fighter, Dr. Hart, what I will do is I'll sit down, not only consult them or have a conversation with the coach, right? With the coaches, with skills coaches, I always want to say, what do you need from me? I don't want to tell them what I'm going to do. If they ask me, what can you do for me? I'm going to say, what do you need me to do, right? Too many performance coaches run in and think they're in charge and they're going to make the difference. So I always sit down in great depth and talk to the skills coach and say, hey, where are their strengths? And both physically, but mentally. And oh yeah, well, he gets really nervous here, or boy, the last week, everything's great till the last week of fighting and he worries about this. Or he's outstanding, but once somebody takes him down, he gets discouraged and then we lose the edge. So in advance, what I try to do, both through conversation with a coach, if they're open to that, and with the athlete, is let them talk loosely. It's almost like a sit down, not a therapy session, but an exchange of ideas. Hey, where do you excel? Where do you feel great? I love being on my feet. I love fighting from the outside. When they take me down, gosh, then I get this and that. So I have to learn in advance, potentially where that mindset might be vulnerable, if you will. And what I can do is certainly chat, talk to them along the way, develop mental skills, build a resume as to why, even though this may not be the optimal position they want to be in, why they could be successful there. What have they done in the past? How much training have you done? Is it really that big of a deal if he takes you down? We'll get right back up. Here's how we can approach that. But additionally, when I'm doing performance training with them, I can do little things such, if an individual hates being on the ground, I might apply a hip thrust, right? The barbell hip thrust. Now, you might say, well, that's not going to stop them from getting taken down. No, but I can, in the back of their mind, while doing that hip thrust, say, hey, this is going to apply to us. If he gets us down, that's all right. We're prepared. We're ready. That's why we integrate this movement into our conditioning program. So what we can do is kind of blend some of the actual physical qualities we're trying to advance and really translate that to the fight. Not just say, oh, you're going to be stronger. No. We're going to have an edge on the outside. Nope, we're going to have great power if we're taken down. Our hips are stronger. They're going to have a very difficult time. So we kind of blend the physical performance with what they need, and then marry that to just trying to give them that mental edge. And if they want to spend more time on the mental side, we will go into the actual mental skill training, the imagery, the visualization, what to write down, self-talk, and so forth. And that could certainly, certainly help, if that makes sense.
No, I think it does. So basically, you're trying to figure out like what they are most fearful of, and then trying to use certain like tactics, like whether they're psychological or physiological, and then trying to make sure that they do become comfortable with that, so they're not basically having the same amount of fear that they were having previously.
That's exactly right. Build a little bit of confidence in all positions, right? And make them know if you get taken down, big deal. I mean, it's actually allowed in the fight. This is not the end of the world. The other opponent is actually allowed to participate and try to make life harder. It's not the end of the world. Okay, he takes us down, boom. Try to really get the mindset to change in that capacity. And that's correct.
And so you've seen, so many different fighters throughout your life, so many different athletes. One thing that often comes up, I've heard various different podcasters, whether it's Joe Rogan or others, talk about it. Do you find that nearly almost all of the athletes who are psychologically really resilient also have difficult childhoods?
That's a really great question. That is excellent. Yes, I think in some cases, but I will say this, Dr. Hart, I don't think all. And, when you look at, just our football league, the NFL, right? National Football League, you got guys in the same position with a completely different disposition, but yet a love for that game. Now, I would say that could be and something that's very advantageous, to have overcome much in life. But at the same time, it can also be a trigger. If you have long-term stress, and those neural patterns are in the brain with a lot of trauma from something, it's also easy to fall back into something that might be negative or at the very least distracting to your fight career. But I'd like to give one example. I can't speak to Merab Dwalishvili's entire childhood, but I know Merab very well because I was part of that team for many years. Certainly by Western civilization standards, he had it a little bit harder. He didn't have all the luxuries we have growing up in the nation of Georgia. And for those who don't know, he's the current bantamweight champion of the world in the UFC.
He
didn't have maybe...
beast.
He is unlike any human I've ever seen, physically and mentally. But, I wouldn't say he's a guy who had tremendous, adversity. He just was determined and focused. And I will say this, not to, as to give you some time to speak back to it. The guy, there are people that want to be a fighter. This guy loves to fight. Okay, there's a big difference. And every time he goes out there, he's really relaxed and happy, like he's going to his own birthday party. So his mindset is very relaxed and he's exactly where he wants to be. So it would be very challenging to say that a lot of the fighters who are all great have overcome maybe past trauma or childhood difficulties. But I'd say it's maybe 50-50, 60-40 have, Okay. So, I think it's worth consideration.
Yeah. So maybe just one point on that. I can see how, it could be a trigger, and then I could also see how it could be an advantage. Because if you have this, really bad psychological trauma, and then something bad happens to you, you could revert into potentially bad habits. But then if you've had psychological trauma and something bad happens to you, you also could say to yourself, well, I've had so many, bad things happen before, I can certainly overcome this as well. And so I could see how both could kind of play to someone's advantage and then also play to someone's, disadvantage. But if someone's had, quote unquote, an easy life, it is still possible to make them mentally tough and resilient. Is that true?
I think so. Yes. And I say think because I hate to speak, as you well know, there's an old saying in science, right? It doesn't prove anything. It just reduces uncertainty. So I always want to be humble in a sense where I say absolutely. But I think, yes, I do. Because there are many wrestlers who come into the UFC and had a pretty good childhood. Mom and dad were there. They brought them to practice before school. They picked them up after school. And yes, did they push? You got it. Yeah, they pushed really hard to be great wrestlers because that sport is right up there with maybe the most demanding, if not the. But in terms, they had good look how many great athletes. Their folks were at every wrestling match or one of their parents were there, right? They picked them up. They gave them the extra coaching resources. They bought them a private coach on top of their wrestling coach. So there are many athletes, if you will, that make it, that have built that mental resiliency in the absence, if you will, of being on a rocky ship their whole life, Yeah,
I think BJ Penn is probably a good example too, because I'm pretty sure he grew up pretty rich. His parents are quite wealthy, I believe. And, obviously he had a tremendous career and was definitely known to be very, very mentally tough.
Yes. I think he is a good example and a superb fighter. And I don't know, GSP's background. Certainly, I am a huge fan. I don't think it was too crazy, but what I loved about him is he was a cognitive fighter. He made himself strong. He made himself resilient. He fought with intellect, because he'll find different ways to beat you. So I think he's a wonderful example. And again, I don't know him well enough to say, but I don't think his childhood was all that. It wasn't easy, but I don't think it was trauma-filled. And look, he's a GOAT, right? Yeah. And then you go the other way. The greatest heavyweight, in my view, if not a fighter of all time, has You know his name. He's a little bit rocky sometimes, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so
Absolutely.
he's just great. Yeah.
And so discipline then, like how much of it then do you think is, say, like self-trained versus innate? Like, do you think that it's, 50-50, or do you think that it just kind of depends upon the person?
That is a really, really great question. And I think it's how they use their mindset to, the first thing is, it is, if you want to, whatever we want to call it, the discipline, which it is, because motivation is fleeting, it comes and goes. It really is defined by what the purpose and what it means to them. And many people have to create their own path and their own journey and process as to how they're going to continue to advance, right? Like for one person, it may be being a great wrestler, being a great MMA fighter, maybe all outcome based. I want to have the glory. I want to be the greatest. I want to be the champ. I want everybody to see that. How they navigate through each practice for that may differ than, like I said, someone like Marab, who just can't wait to get in the gym. But either way, they are building the habits necessary because they have a short-term focus. And I believe these great athletes, their goals breathe. They're not on just paper. They taste them, every sense. They taste them, they smell them, they feel them, they hear them, And so I think that they all build their own method of discipline. Now, there are people too, to your point, Dr. Hart, yeah, they're just very mechanical, very methodical. That's how they live their life. That's how their brain is designed. They get up every day. We call them consummate professional. They practice beautifully. That is, and maybe they don't have too many demons and their brain fires at a different rate than somebody who has high anxiety, but they really want the same goal. So I think that the discipline is built differently in each person. And I would say that some do have a little bit more of a genetic predisposition to that. But I think discipline is also specific to something different. And I'll close on this. Some people, like, I don't have any discipline to sit and stare at a stationary piece of art. Wow, that's great. That's awesome. I'm out of here. This guy's good. That's beautiful. Right? I can't. Some people can look at that and their brain is just completely activated and look at the colors, and they stare at it and they're invested for hours. I think it's the same thing where people do have discipline in many endeavors. They have to find it and where to focus it upon. Okay.
So just want to switch gears a little bit now. I know we covered, quite a bit of psychological stuff there so far. There's been a lot of use of like Aura and Whoop straps and these kinds of things over the last few years. Just wondering, do you use those kinds of things when you train athletes, and do you train them differently, according to certain metrics?
Yes, that's a great question. And I think they're helpful, but that's the word, right? They're helpful. What we're trying to do with anything that could measure psychophysiology, mind and body, or peripheral physiology, is we look for trends. There's a tendency for people, as you well know, to look at one variable and go, hey, HRV, their HRV went down for 3 days. Uh-oh, go to bed. Well, okay, there's a host of things that can impact that. But if you use an Aura ring, which is not like polysomnography where you're going to have a really good sleep assessment, and you see, wow, it does appear that they're moving more, not getting as good sleep. Their resting heart rate seems to be a little bit elevated. HRV seems to be down. Respiratory rate is up at rest. So you take these 7 or 8 pieces and you look at them and go, it looks like we're going in the wrong direction. Because these are not perfect measurements, but they're a trend. So I think there's value if we don't rely on one metric. But if we look at the picture as a whole, like if I take those 7 or 8 metrics and I see an athlete coming into the gym with their head down, wiped out, and not in the mood to train that day, I think that's a pretty good indication they should go home the following day eat, sleep, get in a dark room and go to bed, right? I think that could be helpful.
In terms of HRV specifically, like what are the numbers that you see for athletes, especially like the guys who are going through training camps?
Well, the hope, I mean, in general, like what we're trying to see, I mean, I'll keep it simple because the numbers are all over the map depending upon where the athlete starts. But the trend during a training camp, I think, we're trying to maintain qualities because if you're looking at a fighting athlete, the problem there is they're training 3 times a day or 2 times a day because they need multiple skills. And now the one major thing of many that you need to recover is nutrition, and they're depriving themselves of calories. So to be honest, with the stress of the camp, both physiological and mental, it is my hope that most of the qualities that we look at, HRV particularly, will be maintained. I don't even know if I'm going to see an improvement sometimes. Now, this could be, to your point, very contingent upon the mindset of the athlete, or there are some coaches, honestly, that train these guys a lot and maybe overreach them a little bit. So I think what I have to look at is, okay, where are they? How much time do they have? How much weight are they losing? Who's the coach? Are they sleeping? And that's the number one question. Are you sleeping? And then hopefully if their HRV can be maintained at a given level, if it goes down, if it goes up, wonderful. Some people do exhibit that, but others are under so much stress, right? That I'm hoping that any quality, physiological and mental quality that they have is maintained during camp.
In terms of like specific numbers, like do a lot of the athletes have HRVs like in the 80s and the hundreds, or is it more in like the 20s or 30s? Like what do you typically see?
I most of the time, I'll see more in exactly the area you gave me, like about 80 range or 90. It depends, you know. Now
that's pretty high.
So most
of the athletes have ranges like in the 80s.
It's very high. Pre-camp, okay, because they're in good shape, they're eating what they want, they're kind of happy, right? You know, they don't have the fight date yet, but they're still training. They're in good shape. They're happy. They're healthy. They're sleeping. They could get up a little later, right? They're not deprived of calories. The stress of the fight date isn't there yet. The media isn't hitting them. People on social media aren't crushing them and making fun of them yet, even though they're a world champ. So yes, before, believe it or not, is when we see a lot of the better numbers. And I'll say this, the lighter weights are in the 80s, not the bigger guys. They tend to be a little bit lower, okay?
How much lower are we talking?
20, maybe 60, you know, it depends too, so I've seen those numbers. I wouldn't say that's the average, that's better. We're talking more of a 60 to 80 range. However, to reiterate, that fluctuates a lot during camp. And you see acute fluctuations, like one night bad sleep, and they're down. Couple of days good sparring, good sleep. There's a correlation. Like you really want to keep your eyes on that. But they usually, and I have a few numbers. I don't have 100 on HRV, on fighters. So probably 10, 15 pre-camp and during camp. So I would say that if they're an athlete that stays in reasonable shape and always trains, their HRV is better before the camp starts, whenever they decide, than during the camp, believe it or not.
Okay. And how about resting heart rate? What's usually the resting heart rates of these guys, and how does that fluctuate throughout camp?
Yeah, so I would say, host of variables, right? Body structure is going to be a big factor. Like you can have a guy who's 5'5" fighting at featherweight and a guy 6'1". They're going to have probably different fiber types. They're probably going to have different cardiac output. But most of the guys will start at camp mid-50s, right? Nothing crazy, but sound, very sound. 55, 60. Remember too, Dr. Hart, at that time, their weight's higher. All right. So if your weight's higher, you're going to require more oxygen, even if it's extra fat. And you're going to need more blood to be pumped to the peripheral tissues.
Hey, now, Tony, you can call me Mike, by the way.
Okay, Mike, thank you. Yeah. And So what'll happen there is I usually, the independent, see, this is kind of interesting. Resting heart rate could go down, and yet HRV might go down a little too. So there's not always a direct correlation. I would say here's the general averages, and the UFC will probably have that, and if so, I'll actually pick up. I don't even know if they've done heart rate though. Middleweights, not even middleweights. Let's go lightweight, 155 and down. They're going to be in the low 50s. The bigger guys are going to be a little higher. You start getting to middleweight 185, light heavyweight 205, and heavyweights, you're going to see resting heart rate in many cases that hovers around the 60s midday. If they're active, if they're a heavyweight, let's say light heavyweight who fights at 205 and at 255 right now, I don't think no matter what they're doing, you're going to see a good resting heart rate. But I'd say 50s for the lighter weights pre-camp, 60s for the bigger guys if they're staying in reasonable condition.
And so these guys have unbelievable cardiovascular conditioning. Sometimes you see cyclists get down into the 40s, into like the 30s. How come you don't see the UFC athletes get to those numbers?
Great question. I haven't seen any, but I do know. When I say I haven't, the guys I've worked with, but I do have a good friend, for example, Chris Algieri, who was a junior welterweight champ, WBO, in an elite condition, and that was a major part of his success. Very cerebral fighter and great conditioning. He's been at 42 before, right? But again, he's 5'10", 100, and let's say in fight shape about 41 pounds, in the 60s on average. There's a couple of factors. I think one of them is that during the fight camp, it will go down lower, even sometimes when stressed. Why? Because they've reduced their body weight. That's a big factor. If you lose weight, you're going to need less cardiac output, right? And so these guys are going down. So the guys who are in the 50s may hit the high 40s. Someone like Merab Dvalishvili may hit probably 40s, maybe even a high 30. But I think there's a couple of factors here. The body is trained for multiple stimuli, right? And many biomotor qualities. So in one sense, they have to stay really strong, do some strength and power work, which is needed. They have to have great localized muscle endurance, cardiorespiratory endurance. They need agility, speed, power. They need every quality, almost like a tennis player. Whereas the cyclist is using, just the lower extremities only. You could take a look at the leg structure compared to the upper body structure, and the upper body structure is somewhat diminished. So I think that it is really a lot to do with the specificity of the activity. In better words, the cyclist is also, they're going for hours of cardiorespiratory. Here,
and they're all small too.
Say again, I'm sorry?
They're all small guys. None of them are big. Like some of them are like 130, 140, maybe 150 pounds, You know
that better than I, and that's exactly right. So there are MMA guys who can reach that. I'm not saying they don't. They definitely do. But again, the high 40s, I think, would be in elite fight shape for fighters of about 155 and lower.
Okay. And in terms of sleep, we know that that's, absolutely massive in terms of not only just, physical performance, but also mental performance. Is there a specific number of hours that you aim for all your fighters to get? And do you get them to look at like their REM sleep and their deep sleep, or how do you sort of approach their sleep overall?
Yes, I think that, again, like I said, the tools that we have for managing sleep are pretty good. And people will say to me as example, if you use a Whoop band or Aura ring, and they'll say, Tony, well, that's not entirely accurate. Well, neither is guessing, right? Neither is guessing. So at least we have some data that may show, again, a general trend or general direction which something is going. Now, optimally, here's the bottom line. I would love for them to sleep and sleep a lot. And I think, 9 hours, potentially 10 if they had to, because the sheer volume of tissue damage, the recovery, that even the brain demand, right? You need a lot of hours to wash out the metabolic byproducts in a brain. This isn't just about a muscle. This is about getting in that deep sleep so that you strengthen the neurons of the skills that you were learning that day, cleaning the brain out of tremendous stress, of the fight, of learning, of the pressure. And you're taking, occasionally, not all the time, but in camp, you're sparring. Now you got some headshots going on, right? And so we got to get rid of that inflammatory process. So I think to be safe under optimal conditions, if the athlete could put in 9 or even just stay in bed for an extra hour and just be in bed for 10 hours, I know it sounds crazy, but it would probably be optimal because the recovery demands are crazy. These are super physiological training volumes. And on top of that, if you're in camp, now you cut your calories, right? And you're being asked to do more. So I really would love, I don't think we've isolated the optimal hour, but I think about 9 I would really love to see them off their feet for 9 hours if possible.
Do you ever see some athletes that use an Aura or Whoop and then they kind of get too obsessed with it?
Absolutely.
And you have to tell them, like, listen, you got to take that ring off because it's messing with your head.
Yes, absolutely. And many times when I use little devices, right, even if I did their body fat, I had a portable ultrasound system, which was actually pretty good. It wasn't great with visceral fat, but most of these guys don't have a lot of visceral fat during camp. But nevertheless, whenever I got numbers, they were for me. Because just in case they weren't where we would like them to be, you have said it. Then it was Dan.
Dan Henderson?
No, it was Dan. The guy, is that how we say his name? He was at the UFC last week when I was speaking there. And he said he goes through those phases, Mike, where he'll wear his Aura ring and he'll wear everything the UFC gives him and he's possessed. Uh-oh. And then he'll just blow it off for 2 weeks because the mental strain of being overly obsessed is too much. So I think absolutely what I would say to them, wear the ring, let me worry about it. Right? Yeah. I'll give you the feedback because you bring up a great point. Yes.
What do you do or what do you say to athletes, say if they sleep poorly before a big fight and then they're worried about their performance?
Great question. What we have to do there is emphasize, even though it may not be entirely true, emphasize the aggregate. We improve this much, we improve 90%. Okay, all we have to do is for one night, hey, yeah, we didn't get everything we want, but that doesn't mean we're not going to perform at an elite level, right? I mean, so if you see those markers, you do still want to convince the athlete that independent of maybe 1 or 2 bad nights sleep prior, which is not uncommon, we still have the aggregate on our side of 10 weeks of good sleep, good nutrition, improved skill acquisition, mental fortitude. Okay, so now we're being asked for the last few hours just to give either 15 minutes or 25 minutes independent of the other variables of all we have. And we are capable of that because so it's really a catch-22. Because I just told you 2 weeks of bad work or mental work can destroy 10 weeks. Conversely, I now have to work with them and say, 1 bad night isn't going to do anything. No, I know you're a little tired, but we can activate that. We can overcome that easily. So you have to play ping pong. And whatever it is, you do want it, and arguably you can sell it into a positive. Because there is a positive in it, but you have to extract it. You can't just, all right, they got to find that positive in that belief.
What about caffeine? Is that something that most fighters use during camp? And is it something that you encourage them to use? And how much is too much and how much maybe is even too little?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think body weight's a major variable. Like anything else, right? We sit there and we go, and here's my disappointment with creatine. We do studies on athletes and some of the guys are 260 pounds and we're giving them 5 grams. And there's another athlete in there who's 150 and we're giving them 5 grams, right? There's a big difference in total skeletal muscle volume there. So that's a really good question. I would say I try to keep an eye on it. I don't want them to get fanatical about it, but I think caffeine is a good ergogenic aid, right? I think it can be part of a camp. I think that where I get worried is, and everybody has a different sensitivity with adenosine receptors. Some people can do a Starbucks double venti with 2 shots in it at midnight and go to sleep. But what I try to do is, okay, let's use it exclusively for each training session. And let's keep the dose somewhere 150 to 200 milligrams. And if it's twice a day, they're in the 400 milligram range. I think 6 starts getting high for the lighter guys, right? Again, we tend to that broad sword, I think we've got to get away from that with dosing. So caffeine, you could look at I think Dr. Antonio is very much an expert in it, but 4 to 5 milligrams per kilogram of body weight, right? Throughout each dosing in order to optimize the potential ergogenic benefits, which would be mental alertness, mobilizing more fat, maybe a small altered pain perception and so forth. So I think it's good. I think it should be used for sessions only.
Probably a question I know that I should have asked Dr. Antonio, but I'm sure you know the answer as well. So regarding creatine, a lot of people now are using 10 grams a day. They're not using 5 grams a day because, they believe that it gets into the brain when you're using that kind of dose. But, you were just mentioning body weight. So my question is, if you are using more than 10 grams of creatine a day, should you split that dose, or is it okay to take 10 grams all at once?
That's a great question. I think it's very much contingent too upon, I know the creatine lovers, of which I am, find this hard to believe, but some people's gut, it gets bothered by a large bolus, nothing significant. Right? I feel it a little bit like, oh, hey. And also I think another factor is, I like splitting it personally. I like splitting it. And the reason why I like splitting it is because I think one of the major factors, Mike, is how much weight do you put on? Because it varies significantly from person to person. This is anecdotal, but even Dr. Scott Forbes, Dr. Darren Candow, proud Canadians, by the way, and very much to be proud of them, great creatine researchers. They are leaning towards splitting it as well. And they think, I say think, or we speculate right now based on the data, it may mitigate some of the effects of weight gain a little bit too. I have found it does. If I do a 10 gram bolus, I put on a lot of weight. I don't want to do that. It's not bad weight. I just don't want the weight. If I break it down 5 and 5, it seems that weight comes on less, and I certainly get no gut irritation. So my thing is this: if the athlete needs to take it all at once because they got a busy day, or an average individual wants to take it at once and they feel great taking it once a day, great, do it. If your stomach occasionally does bother you a touch, and again, nothing major, and you are one of the body types that tend to put a little bit more weight on from creatine, I think the 5 and 5 may have merit.
Okay. And since we're on the topic of supplements, are there any supplements that you recommend to athletes that they take all the time, and maybe some just for peak performance?
So I do think creatine, obviously, because we're seeing long-term benefit, neuroprotective. And again, there are a lot of studies, and there's some data on TBI, which is not my area of expertise, but it does seem like the long-term use, prophylactic use, may mitigate some of the inflammatory responses post-trauma or contact. Okay, so it would make no sense, certainly, to cycle the creatine. I think, obviously year-round whey protein, because as I tell my athletes all the time, it is, when you're training this hard, you have to get your numbers in. We don't store protein, right? I have 70,000 calories in fat on me that I could use. It's like 3,000 calories in glycogen at any one time. I've never heard anyone say to me, Tony, I want to get this protein off my waist by the end of the summer so I look good. There's no protein storage. So we have, if this athlete is not getting, they need 200 grams, that's a lot of eating. And it's a big bolus. I mean, it's either 450s or 540s. That's a lot. So whey protein should be in there annually if you're not getting it. I love that to be there. I do like omega-3s. I think they have, I think there's some merit to their neuroprotective effect. The myelination, our brain contains a lot of the essential fatty acids, of course. The myelin sheath does. So I think there's great benefit there. As far as the performance supplements, then I like to go into the camp, certainly beta-alanine. I think it's a great supplement, right?
And one that I find is often not used appropriately, because a lot of people think it's just like a pre-workout supplement.
Absolutely.
But beta-alanine is something that you have to store up. So like I take beta-alanine, but I'll take it like 3 times in a day, because like, you know, some people would find it that it's very odd for me to take beta-alanine in the morning before I go to work. And it's like, well, I'm trying to get 6, plus grams a day. Exactly. I don't want to take 6 grams at one time, because then I will get the tingles. But if I can take 2 grams 3 times a day, then I'm getting, the full benefits of it. And I'm also not getting, the tingles, the paresthesias, or, whatever that people want to call them.
Yeah, perfect example. You just found your best way to do that. And that works with the creatine and the beta-alanine. Because by the way, that's probably why they do put it, obviously, in all the energy drinks, right? Because that little tingly feeling, people think they're getting an immediate benefit, the paresthesia. But that is a great point. It is an aggregate. It is not like caffeine. We're not talking a 1 hour immediate effect and a 4 or 5 hour half-life. So you have to build it up. But I think it has a lot of great value when doing that, particularly during the camp, because the localized muscle training volumes are tremendous. And my thought has always been this, Mike: better endurance and better motor patterning, because you're not getting tired, means better skill acquisition and application. So if you could punch 15 more times because you have beta-alanine in there buffering the localized hydrogen ions, and you got 15 better punches, well, you have learned more effectively. And that's where I think it comes in. Being in shape is not just about being able to do something. It's about being able to improve something, because you can do it over and over. And
the beta-alanine, the way that works is that it does buffer your lactate threshold. Is that correct?
It can. So what it does, yes, those hydrogen ions build up locally, so it works very well locally, because you have carnosine, which is an amino acid that gets, as you train, particularly repetitive volume in one given area. So like punching, the deltoids, the triceps, for example, the lats, okay? So you're going to build up intracellular carnosine there, because you consistently are in, right, anaerobic or fast glycolysis. I mean, there's no way you can just throw 300 punches at a bag in 3 minutes and expect your aerobic system to facilitate the energy requirements. So what happens there is you're going fast glycolysis, you're ripping through glucose, and you're getting a lot of hydrogen ion buildup from the pyruvate to lactate. All these hydrogen ions free up, and they burn. Literally, they change the pH and burn. When you say you get a burn, it is a burn. What the beta-alanine does is increase the levels of carnosine, which works well to buffer the drop in pH, the acidic drop that comes from the hydrogen ions, so we can still get effective skeletal muscle contraction, both at the neuron level and intracellular level. Yeah. So it's a great supplement.
Interesting. Yeah. And then, just because we're talking about beta-alanine, why not then just take like L-carnosine on top of it? Or is that something that wouldn't provide any additional benefit?
That is an excellent question. I think it has a lot to do with the bioavailability of oral absorption. I'm not an expert on that, but that's what I've read. Yes, okay. I think there's an issue in entry in carnosine. Okay. That is, from what I know, why we're not doing that, because it's a great question that I've asked before. And I think bioavailability with carnosine straight through the gut doesn't seem to be as effective. Yeah. Okay.
Maybe I'll just name off some of the other ones that I use, and you can let me know if they're effective or not. So I like the beetroot extract. I like taking about 200 to 300 or 1,000 milligrams, before any kind of workout, even not just endurance, strength training as well, just because I do feel like it does have some additional benefits for general health, like particularly on blood pressure. And then I don't necessarily take HMB all the time, because I get my protein is so high. I don't know if it's really necessary. But if there's a day where, for whatever reason, I didn't get that much protein and I'm going into a workout, and I'm a little bit afraid that I'm going to be burning some muscle, then sometimes I'll use that. And then the one that I like to use, particularly before MMA workouts, is Alpha GPC. And I take quite a high dose. I take about 1,200 milligrams. And I find that that does give me a little bit of a mental boost.
Okay, fantastic. And I will tell you straight out. So love the betaine, love the beetroot. The data is becoming better and better. And I concede I had to change my mind over time. So the athlete would get a great effect. I'd like it during camp, which I think is great. You mentioned, I'm sorry, so right after that, you said
Alpha GPC.
Prior to that, I'm sorry, the betaine.
HM,
great,
HMB,
great, thank you.
Yeah.
By the way, and we wrote a position stand. Dr. Peacock's on that, Dr. Antonio and I, as well as members of the UFC, and Dr. Jeff Stout and Dr. David Fukuda from UCF, who helped contribute to my section on that on HMB. So if particularly, Mike, you're in caloric deficit, the value is great. So I do now, to your point, recommend that during camp for the fight sport athlete, because again, if you have to lose a lot of weight, we're in a calorie deficit, and the preservation of lean tissue is vital, because if we lose too much, we lose power, we lose speed, we lose strength. So it's a great supplement choice, particularly for the athlete in low calories. And then I got to learn a lot more. I'm going to open up to your testimony on the Alpha, because I've read of it, but I've never used it. So maybe it's something I should pay more mind to. Sounds like it's great, particularly on the cognitive side.
Yeah, I find it like particularly great on the cognitive side. And I think there are some people who, use it daily. I think Andrew Huberman is actually a pretty big fan of it. But I do find that it works better just when I use it sporadically. Now, maybe it's just because, like we were talking about before the show, I train with a guy, Chad Laprice, who's a pretty, intense guy. And we basically spar every single session, do pads super hard. And maybe that's what, gets my cognition going after the session. But I do find that when I just limit it to once or twice a week, I do get more of a benefit, meaning that I think that I do get maybe a little bit used to it. But again, I'm not sure if that's just me or if it's in my head. But just something that I've kind of, noticed when I've done training is that I find that it's better if I just use it once a week, and I use like a fairly high dose. I think a lot of times people use like 300 to 600 milligrams. I like to use, 1200 milligrams. And I find that does just give me a little bit of like a cognitive edge, as more than say like an athletic or an energy burst.
Okay, very good. That's great knowledge for me, and I'm going to look into that. And what is the time between dosing and activities? Like, what's the duration?
Yeah, so you do have to take it about 30 to 45 minutes before, and it is good with a little bit of fat. So it's not terribly like convenient. You can't just kind of slam it like coffee for me anyway before, because I'm an ultra fast metabolizer. I've had some genetic testing done, so I can slam an espresso 15 minutes before, and like I'm good to go. It's perfectly in my system. Now, if you're a slow metabolizer, you might need to take your caffeine an hour before, right? But I'm just not one of those people. And then maybe the very last thing that I'll mention, and maybe we can talk a little bit about nutrition after this too, is exogenous ketones. Have you ever had any athletes fool around with exogenous ketones and found there to be any kind of beneficial effect?
I have not. Obviously, Dr. Agostino is an expert in that. We had him on our podcast at one time. So I have to date not used them. And let me say this too, because of my so much work going into research right now. I don't have that many athletes I'm working with. I'm bringing them into a lab now instead of training them in the capacity that I used to. So I think that it's something that I could give serious consideration to, but I have not used them yet. There are a lot of athletes that have anecdotally said fantastic. I have found a bit more praise from the endurance athlete than I have more for the power endurance athlete, or as example, tennis or MMA or basketball or something along those lines. So something where the exposure to the activity is more consistent, like the cycling, the distance running, cross-country running. That's where I have read a bit more benefit and seen more testimony to that. But that doesn't mean there wouldn't be great application in the metabolic or bioenergetic demands of the sports we're talking about. So it would be something that I could give serious consideration to in the future. Like if I'm working with somebody now and somebody has asked me, and hopefully I can have the time, to go through the full camp with them, I would give serious consideration to putting that in. It is definitely a primum non nocere, first do no harm. And I don't see any data that shows any harm at all. So why wouldn't we try them?
And in terms of ketosis itself, have you ever had an athlete, like a really high level athlete doing, MMA and doing a lot of cardio work, actually benefit from a ketogenic or low carb diet? Or do they necessarily always have to have a little bit of carbohydrates to get their peak performance?
Okay, that's an awesome question. And there probably could be some. So there's not being evasive. If you have if you have a guy who's has the misfortune of being built like me, 5'7", 212 pounds, and no matter how much weight I lose on my waist, I weigh more. I don't get it. Muscle just comes on my body. And that, I'm not trying to sound conceited, that's not something I want. So I think if you have somebody that is going to be much more type 2, highly glycolytic athlete, and their endurance is based upon their ability to quickly resynthesize ATP PCR, recycle lactate, buffer very well, right? They're getting through the fight differently than the guy who's 6'1", 145 pounds, and is basically a walking type 1 fiber, right? And they may not have the same power or explosiveness, but they could fight 9 rounds. So I think that if we look at the individual's metabolism, the variables in that, and by the way, Dr. Roman Foman, his birthday today, sports science director at the UFC, is doing this. He's testing the ATP PCR system, the glycolytic system, the aerobic system, and finding out where the athlete's strong and weak and learning how to either supplement or upregulate that training. So I think depending upon, right, because a type 1 fiber, you're going to use those ketones. You're going to need the mitochondria, right? We need to start breaking that down there. So if you have the athlete that has the capacity to metabolize them more effectively, they could be of good use. If you've got a human type 2 fiber with a head and, a couple of arms who is walking glycolytic, they may not benefit as much. So I think we have to look at who is using them, in order to get that benefit. But I haven't had anyone yet who did them and did the keto diet. Sorry, I went off track a little bit, because the keto diet is specific to what we just said. If you're a glycolytic athlete, probably not the best idea. If you have tremendous endurance and you work on burning and oxidizing fat is a significant contribution to your fight performance more than the glycolytic athlete, then the ketones may have greater value.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I think that there is some therapeutic value, like maybe in using the ketones and, carbohydrates like before a race or something like that. But I just don't know if it's healthy, maybe long term, just because we're not really supposed to have both of those sources of fuel. Like, we're really just supposed to be running on carbohydrates, or we're supposed to be running on ketones. So, but maybe I'm wrong. Like maybe there is nothing detrimental to it, but I just kind of, I guess, it's a concern for me, just because, we haven't had anyone actually use like both sources of fuel like at the same time, where they've had high ketones and high carbohydrates, because we've only had exogenous ketones for like less than 10 years.
Great point. I think that's a brilliant point, right? If you're of Inuit culture 10,000 years ago, you better make ketones because you're eating a walrus and salmon, and it just is no carbohydrates growing. If you're in an area where you're loaded with carbs, maybe Japan thousands of years ago, you can grow rice. Great, you don't need your ketones. So that's a brilliant point about how do they interact together. Good point.
Yeah, something that we definitely need to figure out. I know I only have you there for a couple more minutes, but one thing I want. Okay, excellent. One thing that I did want to ask about, because I know that this has become extremely popular over the last 3 to 5 years or so. Cold plunges and saunas. Do you get athletes to use these, and have any athletes seen a lot of like benefit from it? Particularly with the sauna, like post-workout, like some people are reporting that it does help with recovery. And then for, the cold plunges, some people report that if they use it pre-workout, not post-workout, but pre-workout or just in the morning, it does help overall a little bit with energy.
Yes. Great. So really good questions. I do think I think the sauna has to be utilized very strategically. I do think there are great benefits. Obviously, there's vasodilation. So that's always good. I think that sauna is a great tool. We'll talk about it in two capacities. Certainly, the heat will dilate the blood vessels. It'll relax the musculature, right? Because you have to open up the muscle to open up the blood vessels to sweat. So post, that can be very beneficial. The however is, don't train here in August in Southeast Florida, lose 6 pounds, and then go right into the sauna, because now we've got dehydration issues. So, if you're going to rehydrate and go in, we're not doing this, to just be tough. I think that if you balance it with smart fluid replenishment, and then you go in to relax a little bit post-training, those advantages could be there. Because if you dilate and open up the blood vessels, okay, that could get rid of some of the metabolic byproducts, right? Reduce muscle tension, which, by the way, is probably pretty high after you've been kicked, punched, and choked, because there's a general sympathetic response. I mean, you get kicked in the leg, it's not just your leg is tight, your whole body's responding to that. So going into the sauna for the reason of dilation, recovery, and relaxing and slow breathing, if you're properly hydrated, can be great. The sauna is also very good for heat acclimation, right? Because sweat glands adapt. They become more effective. We don't know if they undergo hyperplasia, but what we do know is they can produce more sweat, more water release per unit when you acclimate to the heat. So why is that important? Because when you weight cut, as unhealthy as it is to lose a lot of water, water is the most refundable product. So if you can lose 5 or 6 pounds and immediately put 5 or 6 back, that's a good thing. It isn't a good thing in health-wise, but it's a good thing in weight cutting. So the sauna has great value for the fight sport or MMA athlete. Regarding the cold plunge, I think so we get a lot of arguments, and you're probably more of an expert than I am, certainly. The first thing everybody flips about is if you mitigate the inflammatory response, then you're decreasing muscle protein synthesis and recovery, right after. You want a cascade of inflammation after training because that signals a lot of the recovery mechanisms. But simultaneously, I mean, if you're banged up it's your 6th week of sparring in a camp and you can barely move your elbow and your knee's swollen and every joint is killing you, I might have to put muscle protein synthesis on the back burner and just do a little bit of a plunge. I know that people are completely against ice as an independent modality or the only modality, but I think just muting the inflammatory response a little bit after very traumatic training sessions is a good thing. Is it great for excitation, sympathetic activation? Does it help there? I think that's very individual. I really do. Some people love it. Some people are petrified of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's pretty individual too. And I've heard other people like Peter Attia say on a podcast too, that even for like the mental benefit, like some people get this tremendous mood benefit from getting in, a cold plunge, whereas like some people basically, just get cold and that's it. So that doesn't really sound very fun, You're
exactly right.
So I know that our hour is kind of coming to a close there, but very last question I have for you. Is there anything, you've had so much experience, training fighters over the years. Is there anything that you used to do that you no longer do now?
That's a really good question too. I would say this, it would be largely probably, Mike, in the performance side, the strength and conditioning side. I used to do probably a little bit more too much Metcon or specificity, if you will, of conditioning that might have overloaded the athlete. In better words, maybe recreating or mimicking a fight, right? So just to give you a quick example, I had one fighter or several fighters that want to do this. Just so we know too, if your fighter's mildly injured and can't spar, this type of training may be advantageous because you're working all biomotor qualities that are included in the fight. But I think, for example, maybe a little bit too much of fight-specific replication. Changing levels, right? Holding a dummy, a throw dummy, and doing squats with that. Then going into a static hold, okay? Then almost doing something like the special judo fitness test where, okay, the athlete does light throws, right? 4 or 5 light throws in a row. Then you get them on the bag, and now they're going 2 minutes as hard as they can on the bag. That type of specificity I really like, and I think it has value. However, if their training volume in the camp is really high, then I'm overdoing it. And I don't want to do that. If they're 7 weeks out and the hand is really bad, but they're still training and they don't want to spar too much and they're losing the specific conditioning that's available in sparring, then I might do that. But I think the one thing is, I think a lot of people can overtrain the fighter by trying to be overly specific and overtaxing the very biomotor qualities they need in the fight, because their skill training is doing that to a large extent. So that's a careful balance. Had I made mistakes in the past with that? I think I have. Fortunately, the guys were studs and they were able to overcome it, but I think I made mistakes with that.
Okay, just one follow-up question on that thing, because I've kind of been fooling around with my cardio a little bit lately. So I really got into like the zone 2 stuff for a while because Peter Attia was kind of
Peter loves that,
and I do think there is, a lot of value to that and like the mitochondrial biogenesis and all that kind of stuff. But in terms of, if you want to get into specific sport training, like say on the treadmill, like yesterday, I did this Norwegian method. They call it like a 4x4 where, it's 4 minutes hard, 3 minutes off, 4 minutes. And then, after that, I kind of thought, I don't know why I'm doing this. I do know why I'm doing it because I, researched and found it was, a good way to increase your VO2 max. But I thought, if I'm trying to basically get ready for, rounds and sparring, maybe I should be doing, 3 minutes on and 1 minute off, because that would be more specific for me. And then there's other people who are using like, the Tabata, which is like, 20 seconds hard as you can, 10 seconds, off. And so, if you were to design, say, like a program for someone who wants to be, say they want to do, 3 minutes on, 1 minute off for 3 rounds, like, would you tell them to do, a little bit of zone 2, a little bit of Tabata, a little bit of like the Norwegian 4x4 method? Or would you say to concentrate more on just doing, 3 minutes hard and then 1 minute off so that you can kind of mimic a fight?
Great question. And I would say in your case, you're a year-round trainer, right? Like you don't have 3 big fight dates coming up. I love the zone 2 prior to camp. I think it does all the wonderful things as an integral part of maintaining good cardiovascular condition in concert with, your skill training, which may not be at the highest capacity. Now, what we've seen, and this is a little different in boxing, but the UFC has found most of the bouts, as an example, like the flurries, if you will, are lasting, hard punching, kicking, 6 to 16 seconds. And then there's a taper. Okay, so it's kind of and the taper depends. Are they heavyweights or are they lightweights, right? It's like in boxing. A lightweight boxer will throw 4 jabs to 1 power hand. A heavyweight's 2 to 1 or 1. So things differ. But I would say what might be most suitable would be a conditioning in that 3-minute round, which would be wonderful. Okay, but I would break that up if you really want the specificity. If your goal is the old saying, why are fish the best swimmers? That's what they do. If you're 20 years old, you can train 30 different ways and get improvement. If we're older, now we got to do what we have to do and not what we don't have to do. So I would take that, because we don't have the same recovery capacity. I would take that 3 minutes and I would look at, if you're doing MMA or let's say just straight boxing, what are the flurries? You're going to do striking, let's say with your coach, and then you're going to go bop, 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 and you're going to hit 15, 20 combos in a row. And then he might say, okay, he'll step back, show you, I want this right hand turning over more, right? So how long is that flurry lasting? In a real fight, we know boxing is you're going for 25 seconds to a slow 20 seconds. Okay, there's exchanges. And MMA is about 6 to 16 to about a 1-to-1 rest, even 1-to-2. So I find, what do I want to be good at? And my adjunct training is that. Okay. Again, because if the fighter, for us, for you and I, who want to be very good at something specifically, and we're not 21 and we have other jobs, we got to do what we got to do and want to be good at. And we don't have room for 30 other training stimuli because we don't have that kind of recovery capacity. right? So if you were to cycle an emphasis on zone 2 for 2-3 months and then really pick up 2-3 months of this type of interval work within that 3-minute round and break that up into 20 seconds high, 30 seconds high, if you will, because it's just hard on a treadmill to go, go up 30 seconds and slow down, but I would say a 1-to-1 work-rest ratio within that 3 minutes, higher, lower, lower. That is a great general method of conditioning for almost any fight sport preparation. And that's a good way to go. So you can cycle it. If your training's a little lighter for 2 or 3 months, let's just say you're busy, you don't get as much striking in, do zone 2. If the striking's picking up and you're going really hard, move into that interval style. I don't know if, for a fighter, again, I would undulate because the key thing to close here, they've got 9 other training responsibilities. So if we think we could mix in 4 or 5 different cardio methods, that's going to be hard. Specificity at that point would be vital. 20 on, 20 off within 3 minutes, awesome.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for clearing up that question.
I hope it's helpful.
Super helpful. You answered one personally for me, and hopefully it, helped out whoever is listening to this as well. So Tony, thank you so much for coming on. It's been, an awesome time talking to you today. So let people know where they can find out or learn more about you and anything else that you have coming up. Yeah.
So, I'm kind of a quiet guy. As much as I talked and enjoyed this with you and couldn't shut up, I don't say, I'm not a big social media guy, but I am on Instagram. My name is Tony, last name Ricci, and my Instagram is sport PSY_SCI, sports psychology, sports science. And I'm on Instagram there. And my email is tony@fightshape.net. Very simple. That's my company name, fightshape.net. And you can contact me with questions. I always like talking with folks. And I have a lot of speaking engagements. I have a NutriBolt conference. One thing I'd like to plug, if you like fight sports, the American College of Sports Medicine now has a great SIG, Combat Sports Special Interest Group, led by Roman Foreman of the UFCPI, ACSM, SIG. And it is really exciting. And I'm going to take a big role in that. And if you love fight sports, there's some great people involved on that group providing great information. So I'll be a big part of that too.
Awesome. Well, that's something that I definitely want to check out. And again, thank you so much for coming on the show and for sharing all your knowledge. I learned a lot today. I'm sure everyone listening did too. So, really appreciate that. And of course, thank you so much, everyone, for listening. And as always, I'll be back with another episode soon.
Thank you, everyone.